The neighborhood was the kind of place realtors loved to brag about: trimmed lawns, matching mailboxes, and quiet streets where the loudest sound was usually the whir of sprinklers. Everything about it was carefully maintained, as if conformity itself was written into the soil. But there was one house that stood out, not for its paint or design, but because of what lived in the backyard. The homeowner, a quiet and reserved man, had built a tall aviary behind his home. Strong beams, fine mesh, and a roof built to withstand storms. It was no casual birdcage.
Oh.
Inside lived a creature that commanded attention, a great horned owl. At dusk, its haunting calls rolled across the neighborhood like whispers, deep and resonant, shaking the silence of the block. Children would point from the sidewalks, their eyes wide with wonder, tugging at their parents' sleeves to catch a glimpse. Adults too, though more discreet, often lingered a moment longer when passing the house. The owl was majestic, its amber eyes glowing under the fading sun, its wings stretching wide with silent authority. It was unlike anything the HOA had ever seen within its perfectly trimmed borders. For most neighbors, the owl was a curiosity, even a source of pride. How many could say their block was home to something so rare, so mysterious? But in neighborhoods bound by rules, pride and admiration rarely last long. And if there was one person destined to ruin the peace, it was Karen. Karen had lived in the neighborhood for years and considered herself more than just a resident. In her mind, she was the neighborhood's moral compass, the living, breathing extension of the HOA rulebook. She wasn't elected, but she didn't need to be. With her sharp tongue and sharper opinions, Karen believed she was the one who set the standard. To her, the owl wasn't majestic. It was offensive. A violation of the suburban order, she demanded. She kept her disdain subtle. On morning walks, she muttered complaints to anyone within earshot. Dangerous bird. Someone's pet could vanish any day now. At HOA meetings, she dropped casual remarks about wildlife infestations and safety concerns. She shook her head theatrically whenever she heard its call in the evening, as though the sound alone proved her point. But whispers and sideways comments didn't satisfy her. Not when she noticed that some neighbors seemed enchanted by the bird. Children talked about it with excitement. Couples admired its calm presence at night. Some even joked that it was more reliable than the HOA's so-called security measures. The praise burned Karen. It wasn't just about the owl anymore. It was about control. If people admired the bird, then they weren't listening to her. If they were laughing at its hoots, then they weren't listening to her warnings. And Karen couldn't stand being ignored. She hadn't yet declared war, but everyone who knew her should have recognized the signs. Her campaign was coming. When Karen started a fight, it never stayed small for Karen long. Never believed in half measures. Once she decided the owl didn't belong, her whispers quickly evolved into something louder, sharper, and far more disruptive. It began with casual remarks, slipped into conversations. At the HOA's monthly coffee meet, she leaned toward a group of board members and said, "You know, I've heard stories. Owls can snatch up small pets, cats, even little dogs. Imagine what would happen if someone's beloved pet went missing because of that thing." The board members shifted uncomfortably, nodding politely, but making no promises. They knew Karen's style. She thrived on drama and carried grudges like trophies. Still, her words lingered. From there, she spread her warnings during morning walks. Passing neighbors, she shook her head gravely. "That owl's unnatural, dangerous. It watches me. I've seen the way it stares. Tell me that's safe." Some nodded sympathetically, while others rolled their eyes the moment she turned away. But Karen didn't care. Every nod felt like a victory. Whispers, however, were too slow. Karen wanted results. She wanted action. So she turned to paper, the most powerful weapon in any HOA battleground. Her complaint arrived at the board's office in bold handwriting, underlined and dramatic, demanded immediate removal of the owl. The reasons she listed were colorful, bordering on absurd. She claimed the bird could swoop down on children, frighten the elderly, or even spread mysterious diseases. She insisted its eerie hoots lowered property values, and that its very existence created a hostile environment for the neighborhood. She didn't stop there. Karen was a storyteller, if nothing else, and she leaned into the role. She swore she had caught the owl, glaring at her with malicious intent. She hinted that it had already stalked her yard, silently plotting its attack. She wrote that she lived in fear each evening, trapped inside her home while a predator lurked in plain sight. The board reviewed her complaint with weary expressions. The aviary was perfectly legal, built to code, and the homeowner had every necessary permit. By the law, there was nothing wrong. But Karen was relentless. When the board hesitated, she doubled down. She began cornering neighbors in their driveways, pressing flyers into their hands, telling them their children might be next. She filmed short rants on her phone, pacing in front of the aviary, while declaring she would not rest until the bird was gone. She posted in the neighborhood's Facebook group, sharing dramatic stock photos of owls with glowing red eyes, warning parents that a monster lived among them. Still, the owl remained silent. Perched in its aviary, it blinked slowly at the chaos swirling around it, unbothered and unmoved. To the bird, Karen's fury was nothing but background noise, no more threatening than the rustle of leaves. But to the homeowner, the pressure was mounting. Letters from the board began arriving, each echoing Karen's demands. Though phrased politely, their meaning was clear. Make this easy on us, and remove the owl. The homeowner stayed calm, unwilling to yield. But Karen wasn't the kind of enemy who backed down. She was only... Summer rolled in. Karen's frustration had boiled past whispers and paperwork. She was no longer content to mutter complaints or post rants online. She wanted a spectacle. She wanted the entire neighborhood to see her as the hero, standing against what she called a predator in their midst. And one bright afternoon, she finally made her move. The sun hung high in the sky, beating down on manicured lawns and the carefully painted fences of the block. Children played with chalk on the sidewalks, neighbors trimmed hedges, and the hum of normal suburban life filled the air, till Karen's voice cut through it like a siren. She marched across the street toward the owl's aviary. Clutching a stack of papers in her hand, another complaint, bold and dramatic. Wig, slightly askew from the heat, bounced with every furious step. She didn't bother with subtlety anymore. This was theater. Enough is enough, she shouted, planting herself in front of the homeowner's porch. This bird is a menace, a threat to our pets, our children, our very way of life, and if the HOA won't act, then I will. Her voice carried down the block. Curtains twitched open, doors creaked, and neighbors peeked out to see what the commotion was. Within minutes, a small crowd gathered, some curious, others amused. Phones were raised discreetly, recording. Karen thrived under the attention. She waved her papers like a war flag, her words dripping with venom. She accused the homeowner of harboring a dangerous beast. She claimed the owl was plotting against her personally, that she lived in constant fear of its piercing eyes. Her gestures grew wilder, her voice louder, her wig slipping further as she raised her arms to the sky. And above her, the owl watched, silent. Still, its amber eyes locked on her like a predator, sizing up prey. To the crowd, it looked almost bored. But in reality, it was focused, tracking her exaggerated movements, her flailing arms, the shine of her wig under the sunlight. Then, in one swift motion, everything changed. With a powerful beat of its wings, the owl launched from its perch. The air shifted, the sound of feathers cutting through it so sudden, so sharp, that gasps rippled through the crowd. Karen froze mid-sentence, her face twisting in shock as the shadow of the bird swept across her. And in a blur of talons and feathers, it snatched the one thing no one expected, her wig. The moment was surreal. 1 second Karen was yelling. The next her wig was fluttering skyward, clutched in the owl's claws like a triumphant banner. The bird soared upward, circling once, as if to show off its prize. The crowd erupted. Laughter spilled into the street, some neighbors doubling over, others clapping, and more than a few capturing the scene on video. Karen stood rooted in place, bareheaded, red-faced, her voice stolen along with her wig. The papers in her hand shook, forgotten, useless. The owl returned calmly to its perch, feathers rustling as if nothing unusual had happened. But for the neighborhood, it was unforgettable.
Bad day.
Karen lost more than her wig. She lost her dignity, and the battle had only just begun. The wig incident spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. By evening, the entire block was buzzing with laughter. Phone screens lit up with shaky videos of the owl's daring swoop. In some clips, Karen's shriek cut off mid-sentence. In others, the camera lingered on the sight of her wig dangling from the owl's talons as it circled above like a conquering hero. For the neighbors, it was comedy gold. For Karen, it was humiliation beyond measure. The next morning, people tried to stifle their chuckles when she stepped outside. Children whispered and giggled, mimicking the owl's wings with their arms. One particularly cruel neighbor edited the video with triumphant music, replaying the moment of the wig snatch in slow motion. Karen was furious. To her, this wasn't a prank of fate or a funny accident of nature, it was a calculated insult. She convinced herself the owl had attacked her on purpose, that the bird's amber eyes held malice, that its swoop was a deliberate act of humiliation. And humiliation was something Karen could never forgive. Her next letter to the HOA was no longer just a complaint, it was a manifesto. 3 pages of anger and exaggeration poured from her pen. She described the owl as a savage beast that had assaulted her in broad daylight. She insisted her wig wasn't merely an accessory but a piece of her dignity ripped from her head in front of witnesses. She claimed the emotional trauma of the attack was immeasurable. The HOA, weary of her dramatics, reminded her politely that the homeowner was fully within his rights. The aviary was legal, the permits were valid, and the bird was cared for under state law. There was no violation. That answer only poured fuel on Karen's fire. She took her campaign online, posting in the neighborhood Facebook group. Her rants grew longer, darker, and more desperate. She shared photos of owls with glowing red eyes, warning parents that their children could be next. She reposted articles about rare owl attacks from across the world, twisting them as evidence that their block lived in constant danger. But instead of rallying support, her posts attracted ridicule. Neighbors responded with owl memes, mocking captions, and sarcastic comments. One person joked, "At least the owl has better fashion sense." Another wrote, "Maybe the owl should run for HOA president, it's already more popular than Karen." Every laugh, every meme, every dismissive comment carved deeper into her pride. She stopped seeing the owl as just a nuisance. To her, it had become an enemy, a rival, something that had to be destroyed at any cost. The homeowner watched quietly as her obsession grew. From his porch, he saw Karen pacing the sidewalks, glaring at the aviary with clenched fists. He heard her muttering under her breath, warning passersby that the owl was plotting its next attack. Perched high in its aviary, it blinked slowly, unbothered by the drama swirling around it. To the bird, Karen's fury was nothing but noise. But for Karen, the fight had become personal. The battle of pride versus feathers was far from over. By midsummer, Karen's rage had boiled into something dangerous. Letters hadn't worked. Rants online only brought her more humiliation. The owl was still there, perched calmly in its aviary, unshaken by her fury. Karen decided that if no one else would act, she would. One evening, just as the sun dipped low and the sky turned shades of pink and orange, she marched across the lawn, armed with weapons. In one hand, she carried a broom, its bristles frayed from years of sweeping. In the other, a spray bottle filled with water. She wore thick gardening gloves and a look of grim determination, as if she were a soldier going into battle. Neighbors noticed almost immediately. Curtains twitched, voices whispered, and soon porches filled with quiet spectators. Phones came out, lenses catching every moment. The homeowner watched from his porch, eyebrows raised but silent. Karen planted herself in front of the aviary, her stance wide and defiant. She pointed the broom like a spear. "You don't scare me," she shouted. "This neighborhood isn't your hunting ground. I'll drive you out if it's the last thing I do." Inside the aviary, the owl remained motionless. Its amber eyes locked on her, unblinking. It tilted its head slightly, feathers ruffling in the breeze, as if trying to decide whether she was worth noticing at all. Karen took that silence as a challenge. She jabbed the broom through the mesh, rattling the sturdy frame. The aviary shook slightly, but the owl didn't flinch. "Oh, you think you can just sit there?" she sneered. "You think you can humiliate me and get away with it?" She sprayed the water bottle through the mesh, droplets scattering across the owl's feathers. For the first time, the bird moved not in retreat, but in warning, spread its massive wings, feathers bristling, and let out a low, guttural hiss. The sound was primal, sharp enough to silence the watching crowd, but Karen mistook it for weakness. "That's right," she yelled, her voice cracking. "You know who's in charge here?" She jabbed again, harder this time, the broom rattling the aviary walls. The owl's wings spread wider, casting a shadow across her face, its amber eyes blazing with intensity. It wasn't afraid, it was asserting dominance. The neighbors began to murmur. Some shook their heads. Others chuckled quietly, already sensing what this would look like online. The homeowner finally stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Karen, stop. The owl is legally protected. Harassing it is against the law. You're trespassing." But Karen ignored him. Her focus was locked on the bird, on reclaiming the pride she had lost weeks before. The HOA president, called by a concerned neighbor, arrived moments later. He tried to reason with her, reminding her that no rule had been broken and that her behavior could lead to fines. But Karen's face was red with fury. She accused the board of corruption, the neighbors of conspiring against her, and the owl of being a tool in some grand harassment scheme. By the time she stormed back home, broom dragging, the damage was done, not to the owl, but to her. The neighbors no longer saw a defender of order. They saw someone unraveling before their eyes, and the owl. It had already settled back onto its perch, calm and unbothered, as though nothing had happened at all. Karen's obsession had reached a breaking point. She no longer trusted the HOA, the neighbors, or even the rules she once worshipped. In her mind, the only solution left was drastic. She would handle the owl herself. So on a moonlit night, she set her plan into motion. The street was quiet, houses dark, the kind of stillness that makes even the faintest sound echo. Karen crept from her home, hood pulled tight over her head, a broom-sized net slung awkwardly under her arm. Thick gloves covered her hands, and dragging behind her was a dented aluminum ladder. She looked less like a suburban resident and more like a cartoon burglar sneaking toward trouble. Her whispers carried into the silence. "This ends tonight. No more owl. No more humiliation." The aviary stood ahead, tall and immovable, its steel mesh glinting faintly under the silver glow of the moon. Inside, the owl dozed. Feathers puffed slightly in the cool night. But it was not unaware. Its golden eyes cracked open, and its head swiveled slowly as Karen rattled the ladder into place. From nearby houses, curtains shifted. A few neighbors, half awake, peeked out. One gasped and grabbed their phone. Another whispered, "She's really doing it." Karen climbed, wobbling on the ladder with the net in hand. Sweat dripped down her temple, despite the night's chill. Her gloved fingers fumbled at the aviary's hatch. She rattled it, cursed under her breath, and finally forced it open just enough to jab the net inside. The owl moved instantly. Not in panic, in power. With a thunderous beat of its wings, the bird surged forward. The air shifted with the force, knocking the net aside as though it were nothing. Karen screamed, the ladder wobbling dangerously under her weight. The owl soared upward, breaking through the narrow hatch, wings cutting through the night like a shadow come alive. Gasps erupted from the gathering neighbors, some horrified, others delighted. Phones recorded every second. Karen clung to the ladder, eyes wide with panic. And then history repeated itself. The owl dove, talons flashing, and snatched not only her wig, but the scarf she had tied tightly beneath it. Ow. Some clapped, others howled, and more than a few filmed from every possible angle. Karen's bare head gleamed in the moonlight as the owl circled overhead, her stolen hair fluttering from its claws. Then came the final humiliation. The ladder tipped, arms flailed, her scream pierced the night, and she tumbled into the grass with a graceless thud. Papers, gloves, and the useless net scattered around her like the debris of defeat. The owl perched triumphantly on top of the aviary, feathers gleaming, eyes fixed on her, as though declaring victory once again. The homeowner rushed outside, shutting the hatch quickly to keep the owl safe. The neighbors, however, couldn't contain themselves. Laughter rolled down the block, louder than any owl's call. Karen scrambled to her feet, face twisted in rage, hurling threats of lawsuits and revenge. But her words were drowned out by the sound of clapping, chuckling, and the click of recording phones. By morning, the videos were already viral. By dawn, the videos had already escaped the neighborhood and spread across the internet. Clips of Karen toppling from the ladder while the owl soared overhead with her wig and scarf flooded social media. Memes blossomed overnight. One showed the owl wearing her wig like a crown with the caption, "New Queen of the HOA." Another looped her fall in slow motion with dramatic music. Within days, the spectacle was everywhere. To strangers online, it was just another viral Karen moment. But to the neighbors, it was the final chapter in a saga that had dragged on for months. The HOA board, embarrassed that their community had become internet comedy, convened an emergency meeting. This time, however, Karen wasn't the accuser. She was the accused. Her trespassing, her harassment of the owl, her disruption of it came under scrutiny. For years, she had been the loudest voice in the room, dictating what was acceptable. She stood red-faced as the president read out her violations. Instead of siding with her, the board fined her for trespassing, warned her that further harassment would lead to legal action, and reminded her that the owl was protected under state law. It was the ultimate reversal. The homeowner, once pressured to defend himself, was cleared of any wrongdoing. The aviary was secure, the permits valid, the care of the owl beyond question. Neighbors congratulated him quietly, some even bringing over gifts, cookies, coffee, kind words. For many, he had become the symbol of quiet resilience against the chaos Karen had unleashed. And the owl, it perched in its aviary as always, calm and majestic. At dusk, its haunting hoots rolled across the block, no longer a source of complaint, but a reminder of poetic justice. For some, the sound was even comforting, as if the bird itself had become the guardian of the neighborhood. Karen, on the other hand, could no longer walk the streets without hearing laughter. Children whispered, "There goes the owl's enemy," while adults smirked behind closed doors. On Facebook, her long rants were ignored or mocked with owl emojis. Even those who had once entertained her complaints had turned away. She retreated indoors, curtains drawn, rarely seen, except for hurried trips to her car. And when she did appear, she wore wide-brimmed hats pulled low, desperate to cover what the owl had twice exposed. But no hat could hide the humiliation etched into her reputation. Her war had ended, not with victory, but with defeat so public it could never be undone. The owl had become a legend. She had become the punchline. And so the neighborhood carried on, lawns trimmed, mailboxes matching, the usual suburban order restored. But every evening, when the sun dipped low and the owl's call echoed across the block, the people would smile. They remembered the ladder, the wig, the chaos, and they laughed softly to themselves. The owl had won. And in that victory, the neighborhood learned a lesson it would never forget. Pride may drive a person to fight battles that need to be fought, but sometimes fate has a way of plucking that pride away, wig and all.